last years, many legal, social, and cultural events have affected the way that we as societies address and view sexual violence. The persistent silences surrounding it, what it is, how general it is, and who should be considered perpetrators and victims of it. Among the supranational legal developments that have been important, particularly in Europe, have been, firstly, the establishment and entry into force of the Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence against Women and Domestic Violence, or better known as the Istanbul Convention. Secondly, the development of jurisprudence around non-consensual sex as rape by the European Court of Human Rights. And thirdly, the more comprehensive inclusion of rape and other forms of sexual violence in international criminal law. Among the most important international socio-cultural events, on the other hand, we can count the social media-driven waves of Me Too's and similar initiatives to break stigmas and silences surrounding sexual violence and its victimization. These large global currents have in turn affected the local drifts. Finland is here no exception. The Nordic country, which is often considered quite conservative in the Nordic community, has developed its 19th century legislative conceptualization of rape as a violation of the sanctity of marriage and husbandry privilege into a violation of individual integrity and sexual autonomy. In the later conceptualization, the individual will and consent of the victim have become more important. The emphasis on consent, or more specifically, the lack of it as the definitory element of rape, is one of the main motivations behind the ongoing review of the Sexual Offences chapter in the 1889 Finnish Criminal Code. After the legislation has been amended, which is scheduled to happen later this year, no should always mean no, as emphasized by the current Finnish Minister of Justice, Anna-Maja Henriksson. It is in the context of this legislative review that we speak here today. We were namely involved in a research project at the University of Turku, commissioned by the Finnish Ministry of Justice to investigate how reported sexual offences fare in the Finnish criminal process, and more specifically, why so few reported cases lead to a guilty verdict and a sentence.
The investigation was carried out on a tight timetable, reflecting the will of the government to rapidly bring Finland's regulation on rape in the line with supranational standards. The project was commenced in July 2019, and the final report was handed to the Ministry of Justice in April 2020. More specifically, the research concerned rape offences that are not investigated, prosecuted, or convicted. The research material consisted of 232 selected decisions by law enforcement authorities from 2018. 65 decisions by the police to close a criminal investigation based on that no crime was committed. 113 decisions by prosecutors to limit the criminal investigation or not to prosecute, and 54 judgments by district courts to dismiss the charges. One important task of the investigation was to find out what types of sexual violence come to the attention of Finnish law enforcement authorities. The report echoed many of the findings of earlier research projects. The victims of most reported offences were women, and the suspects or defendants were almost without exception men. The parties were often previously acquainted, most often in an intimate relationship. Serious physical violence was rarely used, and many victims were in a vulnerable position at the time of the reported offence. Such vulnerability was caused, for example, by young age, heavy intoxication, or sleeping. A second important task that the investigation faced was to evaluate the effectiveness of the Finnish criminal process in reported sexual offences investigated. Based on the written material with its obvious limitations, we found that there are several problems in how Finnish law enforcement authorities manage and conceptualize reported sexual offences. Firstly, many cases are closed due to victims' inability or unwillingness to continue to participate in the criminal process. This problem was exacerbated by lengthy criminal investigations and a lack of reported use of legal and psychological support services by victims, often leaving them in a difficult position. Such findings are particularly worrying as they raise concerns regarding the treatment of victims by law enforcement authorities. Secondly, many investigations did not proceed to prosecution or judgment due to a lack of sufficient evidence. The project data did not reveal the precise actions that were taken by the police in order to gather evidence. Many times, however, the evidence referred to was limited to the hearing of the parties. This means, in other words, that forensic evidence and reports by medical professionals, psychologists, eyewitnesses, and indirect witnesses, together with other circumstantial evidence, appeared to be missing in the closed cases. Thirdly, in the material investigated, the evidentiary threshold was high. The interpretation and application of legislative terms such as coercion and helplessness were narrow in practice. All of these problems, the lacking support for victims, the insufficient evidence, the high evidentiary threshold, and the narrow legal interpretation contribute to the problem of high attrition rates in Finland.
And then a couple of words on consent and the evaluation of consent. An evaluative question for the investigation was whether legislative standards based on the lack of the victim's consent rather than the perpetrator's coercion would be likely to lead to lower attrition rates. In order to understand this question better, a few words can be said about the current regulation of sexual offences in the Finnish Criminal Code. As such, none of the definitions in the chapter regulating sexual offences explicitly contain the word consent. According to the current criminal code, sexual offences are perpetrated through sexual intercourse or other sexual acts carried out using illegal coercion, physical violence being the archetype of such, or through illegal exploitation of the victim. This exploitation can happen by the perpetrator taking advantage of the victim's vulnerability, which is induced, for example, by the victim's young age, her victimization through trafficking, dependency on the perpetrator, being unconscious or otherwise defenseless. As alluded to previously, our investigation, which did not comprehend all sexual offences listed in the Criminal Code, found that in the cases investigated, law enforcement authorities often conceptualize the grounds of illegal coercion and exploitation narrowly. In the light of this finding, one might hypothesize that an insertion of words such as consent or voluntariness would drastically change the evaluation of sexual violence before law enforcement authorities. This hypothesis assumes that a changing of words would lead to police officers, prosecutors, and judges paying more attention to the will of the victim. Interestingly, Our research here provided us with new and deeper insights. While being absent in the text of the Criminal Code, Finnish police officers, prosecutors, and first instance court judges already, to some extent, operate with the concept of consent. In fact, they even sometimes use the word explicitly when evaluating whether a reported incident fulfilled the crime definitions in the Criminal Code. Their conceptualization of the word consent was, nevertheless, understood as the absence of illegal coercion or exploitation according to the Criminal Code. In other words, the use of the term did not work to expand the meaning of the current legislation. In these circumstances, it is quite unlikely that merely the insertion of consent as a new legislative term would lead to drastically different interpretation or practice. Especially in the light of the definition of rape suggested by the Finnish Ministry of Justice in July 2020, questions arise. According to the suggested law with its new definitions, rape is conceptualized as sexual intercourse when the victim's participation is not voluntary. Contrastingly, to this new definition, however, the only two examples listed in the suggested section, rape through coercion and rape through exploitation, are highly similar to the current definition of rape. One can, hence, identify a tension in the draft law between the current definition of rape and one based on voluntariness. In other words, if the lack of voluntariness is thought to encompass a broader criminal definition than the current one, why sustain and limit the examples listed to the ones mentioned in the previous law or the current law? In the light of the findings of our research project, we find that there is a need to further discuss and disentangle the meaning and context of voluntariness and consent in criminal law on the one hand and criminology on the other. And then a couple of words on victims' harms and the remedies for these harms. Another pressing question, complex and partly speculatory as it may be, is whether the multiplicity of harms of victims of sexual violence would be remedied by a legislative amendment to emphasize the consent of the victim. To be able to ponder upon this question further, it's first necessary to analyze victims' harms. In the research material, we were able to trace some of the physical, psychological, social and financial harms induced by sexual violence, mainly through the stories of direct victims themselves. Such stories came to the fore, particularly in the material from the courts, as the latter were more detailed in their emphasis and analysis of the evidence in comparison to the police and prosecutors. Physical harm, retold by the victims, was often of a more subtle nature, for example, pain and ache. Such pain was, on the other hand, often long-lasting, even continuing for months. Some victims were also able to demonstrate evidence of physical marks of the violence, such as bruises or scratches. Victim stories also, and then more commonly than physical harm, contain depictions of emotional, psychological, and social harms. Indeed, in many cases, for example, if the victim was in a vulnerable position, or when sexual violence occurs in the larger context of domestic violence, the need for perpetrators to resort to physical violence might be limited. Many victims experienced fear after the incident, even to the extent that it affected their abilities to move freely, to trust people, and to be able to relax in their daily lives. Some victims had started to isolate themselves, avoiding social situations because of fear, post-traumatic stress, or anxiety. A part of the victims said that they had been threatened by the defendant or his friends and were, as a result of these threats, also afraid to move outside alone. In a few cases, it emerged that the victim had moved to another place due to the distress and perceived inability to continue to live close to or even in the same city or municipality as the defendant. While an overwhelming majority of the victims' stories retold feelings of anxiety, some of the victims said that they had had thoughts of suicide and self-harm, and some had even engaged in self-injury. A part of the victims also said that they felt shame and guilt for what had happened and blamed themselves for it. Many victims, in addition, reported that they were depressed and experienced nightmares and difficulties sleeping. The harms also had financial effects, as some victims emphasized their inability to concentrate on work or studies after the incident. Some had to take unpaid leave from work, take time off, or even discontinue their studies altogether. A part of the victims also had to pay for professional rehabilitation, for example, seeing a therapist, and some had to use antidepressants and other medication throughout the criminal process. Apart from the direct victims, the harms also indirectly affected the victims' families, their partners and friends in many ways. Victims had, for example, problems with their intimate or family relations, and some felt that they did not have the energy to be mentally present, or, for example, to experience any joy of parenting after the sexual violence. Intimate and sexual relationships felt difficult for many victims, as they struggled with interpersonal trust and confidence. Many of the victims' harms can be considered consequences of the sexual violence experienced. Some of the harm, nevertheless, can also be attributed to secondary victimization through the criminal legal process. The latter is known to be burdensome for victims of sexual violence, particularly if they are not treated with sensitivity, if the investigation is not perceived to be prioritized by law enforcement authorities, and if the process is unduly lengthy. To come back to the question of whether renewed legislation would remedy harms of victims, a question that cannot be fully answered based on the results of our research, it can be said that a legislative amendment that emphasizes victims' lack of consent could have a symbolic impact for victims. Such an amendment would signal that victims' stories and experiences ought to be given more importance in the criminal process, which could in turn also make a difference in the legal evaluation of sexual violence. It's nevertheless difficult to imagine that an amendment of the Criminal Code alone would remedy the multiple harms of victims of sexual violence. Here, other accompanying measures would need to be taken. Such measures are, for example, training law enforcement authorities on the implementation of the new law in order to combat the prevalence of rape myths and to increase the victim sensitivity of the criminal process. It could be ensuring the effectiveness and prioritization of the investigation of sexual offences. It could also be guaranteeing the access of victims to free legal and psychological support services and rehabilitation. It could be recognizing victims' needs for protection services And also importantly, making sure that these are actually provided.
So, something about coercion and consent, a brief comparative look to the Nordics. The tension between coercion and the consent in the definition of sexual offences is not only seen in Finland but also in other countries. Looking particularly to our Nordic neighbours, it is evident that consent and the review of sexual offence definitions have been hot topics during the last years. The discussions and criticism against legislation are driven particularly by civil society, not least by Amnesty International. Legislative amendments to emphasize the lack of consent as the definitory element of rape have been made in Iceland and Sweden in 2018 and in Denmark in 2020. The legislation in Norway, on the other hand, has not, at least yet, been amended in this direction. Similarly to Finland, many of the criminal legal discussions in other Nordic countries have focused on the conceptualization of consent and voluntariness. A central question has been whether legislation that builds on the coercion of the perpetrator already protects the consent of the victim to a sufficient degree, or whether a legislative amendment to emphasize consent is necessary. This question is particularly interesting as it boils down the complex relationship between coercion and consent, whether they are polar opposites or whether the absence of coercion equals consent.
Words on broadening the discussion. As compelling as such criminal law discussions may be, they also remind us of the tendency of public, political, and even academic debates to oversimplify structural questions and overemphasize legislative amendments as a vehicle for sociocultural change. Perhaps criminal law is susceptible to such discussions, with cries for harder punishments winning support across political spectra. We would, however, here like to raise a word of warning. As the British criminologist Carol Smart cautioned her feminist companions already in 1989, radical movements ought to be careful when investing their resources in legislative amendments. While such changes may be necessary and positive on the one hand, trusting the legal system to apply them in the way that the movements envisioned might, on the other, be overly optimistic. Keeping Smart's words in mind, we would like to emphasize the need for broader structural changes when looking to reform the criminal legal system to better safeguard victims' material and procedural rights. We would, in other words, like to welcome an increased emphasis on victims' perspectives and rights in criminal legal discussions, but also pose the following questions, broadening the individualistic gaze of criminal law. How is the state fulfilling its due diligence obligations to protect people from sexual violence and to remedy its victims?
How do public authorities encounter and listen to victims?
How do public authorities take into consideration the multiplicity of harms inflicted on victims to redress them appropriately?
How are the rights of victims to financial compensation, full rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantees of non-repetition safeguarded by the state?
Simply put, what does the state do to make sure that victims of sexual violence and their communities can rebuild and continue their lives with dignity?